I'd now like to introduce Fiona Reilly, who is a paediatric emergency medicine consultant and director of training in Queensland. She gave me an amazing kind of life story. So she is a traveller, is artist, really interested in cooking. But what's particularly interesting is she studied and written about the ancient assassins' castles of northern Iran. I didn't know there were assassins' castles, and I look forward to reading about them. But not only that, she's visited the famed court of Kublai Khan in Xanadu, Inner Mongolia, and circumnavigated China. And if you are not, and when she's not traveling, she is allegedly cooking Queensland's best sourdough bread. Fiona is a wealth of experience, and what I think she is about to share will be very powerful. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to talk to you about the travelling doctor's suitcase. The journeys that we take in life are many. The journey of our professional careers, the journey of our friendships and relationships, the journey of our very particular and personal hardships. But all of those journeys meld and integrate together to bring us to exactly where we are right here, right now. I was thinking back, though, to where it all began for me when I was a young doctor, and I wondered if I had a chance to travel those journeys again, what are the essential things I'd want to pack for my younger self in my imagined travelling doctor's suitcase? What might I need for the years ahead? And I wondered, what would you pack for your imagined journey? And I got to thinking that probably no matter where I go, I would take the same 5 things. It wouldn't matter whether it was the volcanoes of central Iceland or the bustling streets of Kashgar in far west China or the beautiful and remote Australian coastline. Or it wouldn't matter if it was the journey that you and I do hundreds if not thousands of times every year, that 4 or 5 steps into the cubicle with a sick child and their very worried family. On all of those small and large journeys, I would want to take the same 5 things. And they are humour, hard work, heartache, humility, and love. Those are the 5 things that have taught me the most about the rich human landscape that surrounds us. They're things that we don't talk about very often, we don't give them a lot of credence or value, we don't analyse them or study them in any depth, but they are the glue that holds you together as a clinician. They are the things that have made you who you are as a human that cares deeply for other humans. You're not going to learn any facts in this session today, but I want you to relax, take up all the space you need. You can close your eyes if you want to, but I want you to open your mind because I'm going to tell you a little story to illustrate each of these 5 things. And as I do, I want you to bring some of your own memories into the forefront of your mind. I want you to hold them there and look at them with compassion for your younger self and to give them the value they deserve because they've made you who you are today. So let's begin with humour. So a long time ago, I was an adult ED trainee doing my compulsory 6 months of paediatric emergency in a children's hospital, and there are a lot of things about that I found challenging as an adult doctor. My paediatric colleagues used to say that I came from this foreign place called adult land, where they did things very differently. And amongst my struggles, one of the things that I found most challenging was trying to remember all the eponymous syndromes that could affect children because there was no section on that in the adult emergency textbooks. And one day I met a little boy called William who had Sturge-Weber syndrome. And at the age of 5, he'd already survived 4 strokes and recovered from them fully. And his mum had brought him to the ED that day because she was worried he might be suffering from early signs of another stroke. But William pretty soon put his mum's and my concerns to rest. Now, William had a shock of white blonde hair and blue eyes and a really cheeky smile. He's what in Australia we might call a real larrikin. And yes, he also had a large facial port wine stain, but that's kind of faded in my memory of him now. And William looked at me and said, "Dr. Fiona, I can count." And I said, "Oh, that's great." And I looked at his mum and she said, "Yeah, well, after all of his strokes, we didn't think he'd ever be able to get to school, but he's done so incredibly well." And she just looked at him with this love of great pride. And she said, "Yes, so he's learning his numbers. William, you should show the doctor how you can count to 20. And I thought, oh, this might go well or this might not go well. But William began with the fingers of his left hand. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then he moved on to the fingers of his right hand. 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I thought, oh, what's he going to do now? But he pulled out his left foot. 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. And then his right foot. 16, 17, 18, 19, 20. And the effort of all of those numbers, he kind of lay back in the bed and his mum and I made congratulatory little noises. You know, "Well done, William, great job, good work." And then this idea hit William like a bolt of lightning. And he sat up in bed and looked at me and said, "And if you count my dick, that's 21. And so, thanks to William, I have never forgotten the features of Sturge-Weber syndrome. And I've also never forgotten the pure joy of laughing together with a child and their family, because laughter connects us, doesn't it? It shortens the distance between us. The scientific study of laughter is really just getting going in the last few years, but it was quite extraordinary when I looked into it. Laughter increases the secretion of IgA in breast milk, for example. It relaxes the vascular endothelium and reduces blood pressure in patients having renal dialysis. Laughter lowers your cortisol and it increases your pain threshold. So right this second would be a perfect time for me to put a cannula in any of you. And in a weird kind of IVF story, 15 minutes of really hard laughter at the time of embryo transfer will almost double your chance of pregnancy. It's quite extraordinary. So those are all happy side effects, but the reason we laugh together is because it connects us as humans together. So I'd like you all just to take a minute now to think of all the Williams that you've met, to think about all the funny situations, the hilarious conversations that you've had with kids. And if you don't work with kids all day, every day, I'd invite you to bring humour into your interactions with them, to not be afraid of being funny with kids because they love it. And what we now know is that it's good for both them and for you. Humour is so important because it helps us to get through the hard work of medicine. And let's be honest, medicine is often terribly hard work, and those moments of magic and wonder can seem quite elusive. So when I was a medical student, I invented something that my friends came to know as happy squares. So every week I would set myself a target of study. This week it was 20 hours, and I didn't do very well. But each square represented 1 hour, and each triangle was 15 minutes, and I would diligently colour them away. And the aim of it was that you couldn't go and do anything that made you happy until you'd actually filled in all the squares. And I must say that, you know, day after day, after week, after week, after week, after month, after month, after month, after year, after year, after year, after year, it was easy to get stuck in the grind and to forget about the big picture. Because there also can be a lot of beauty and poetry in hard work. That was never brought home to me more clearly than when I was visiting the Royal Mosque in Isfahan in Iran. And I met this fellow who was a mosaic craftsman, and he was grinding down a piece of blue tile to exact specifications very laboriously so he could fit it to a larger pattern that he was making. But it wasn't until he took me outside and had me look up with him to show me what that was for that I really came to understand the immensity and the poetry of the hard work that he was doing. And so when we're down in the grind, we can forget about the big picture. But I just want to remind you all what the big picture is. The big picture is that all of that hard work to acquire skills and knowledge is in the service of the care of kids. And that's important because children are the future of our communities, and children are the future of our planet. So I'd like you to take a second and just honour your own hard work, not just in acquiring knowledge and skills, but the hard work you've done to understand who you are as a person and what you stand for. The third thing in my suitcase is heartache, and it's the hardest thing to talk about. I'd had 12 months of experience as a doctor when I was transferred to a big country hospital in Australia, and part of my job there was to provide weekend or holiday relief for some of the rural doctors who were working in much smaller hospitals much further away. With Australia's huge size and its small population, this kind of work actually has its own name. It's called country relieving. And country relieving features very strongly in the medical mythology of Australia. Country relieving is somewhere where you are sent. You don't volunteer to go. You're the only doctor usually in a town of 1,000 or 2,000 or 3,000 people, a tiny, under-resourced place where it might be hours by road or helicopter or plane for help to arrive. And you go for a weekend or a week or two, but you always hope that you'll survive. It's not an experience that you savour. My first experience of country relieving was about 6 hours' drive from my hospital, and I arrived expecting to take handover from the doctor, but he'd left hours ago for his beach house at the coast. The town had 1,000 people and it was famous for its oranges and mandarins, and in citrus picking season the population doubled to about 2,000 with fruit pickers. They all stayed in the big mandarin caravan park in town. When the doctor rang me, he said, "Well, there's 10 patients, Fiona. 9 of them are very old and they're waiting for nursing home placement, so you don't need to worry about them. But there is a 30-year-old woman who's 34 weeks pregnant who's got biliary colic. She just got back from the base hospital yesterday where they did an ultrasound, so we know that's what it was, and she just needs some time and some pain relief, and then she'll be fine." I said, "And the baby?" He said, "Yeah, the baby's fine too." So I went to introduce myself to her, but she was asleep, so I let her rest. And later that night, the nurse called to say she'd given her a little bit of morphine, but her obs were fine. She was sleeping again. And then the next morning, a sunny Saturday, I got a much more urgent call. The nurse asked me to come back to the hospital. And when I arrived, she was lying in her bed with very laboured breathing. She was pale. She was unconscious. She must have had a pulmonary embolism, I thought, because that was the first thing I thought of. And then I thought, well, maybe she'd had an amniotic fluid embolism, but I'd only been working for a year and never in obstetrics. I had no idea what that might even look like. "We need to get her into resus," I said. So the nurse and I and the cook, who was the only other person at the hospital, carried her into the resus room. And as the nurse put some oxygen on her, I tried to get a drip in. And at that point, I noticed that her chest and belly had stopped moving. When I felt for a pulse, there was none. "Start CPR," I said to the nurse, and she did, and I took over and grabbed an ambu bag. I said, "We need more help," and the nurse looked at me and said, "There is no help, there's just you and me." the cook didn't count. At this point, I started to feel a pain in my teeth, a pain that I later came to recognise as extreme fear. I wanted somebody to tell me what to do. I wanted to call the base hospital and have them tell me what to do, but the phone was attached to the wall in a room 2 rooms away from where we were. I couldn't leave this woman. So we kept doing CPR, and the nurse who had been asleep in the nurses' quarters returned with the cook. And so finally I could hand over the ambubag to her and try and get a drip in this woman. I gave her a dose of adrenaline. I hand pumped a litre of fluid, neither of which had any effect. I gave a second and a third dose and another litre of fluid. Still nothing. I realised that the decision was going to have to be mine to make. I didn't want to make it. We need to do a caesarean, I said. Get the caesarean kit. And at that point, the 2 nurses looked at me and said, "We don't have a caesarean kit." I said, "Get a scalpel, get some drapes, whatever you've got, just bring it." And I took over bagging the patient again as she went back and forth and back and forth. And when she finally returned, it was with the tiniest scalpel blade, the sort that you might use as a suture cutter if you didn't have anything else. And at that point I knew it was futile, and I looked up to see the woman's husband who'd just arrived in the doorway of the resus room, his face ashen. I spent most of that afternoon as a 24-year-old doctor with her family in the big Mandarin caravan park, turning down offers of tea and beer as they discussed what they'd like to put in the coffin with her, her favourite pot plant, videos of her favourite TV show, all the baby clothes she'd collected. The post-mortem showed that she died of a massive uterine rupture. At 30 years of age, she'd had 17 previous miscarriages, 17 previous D&Cs, and in fact she had a congenitally abnormal uterus, but nobody knew about that at the time. I couldn't understand why her family would want to have me there with them, and it took me decades to understand that they wanted me there because I was the person who tried to save her, and because I was the person who'd been with her as she took her last breath. I know you all carry this heartache. We all do. It's a collective trauma we all carry. The patient who died unexpectedly, the patient who died despite everything being done, the young patient who died too early, the old patient who died alone. We wish we'd done something differently. We all have these stories and these patients, and we carry them round with us in our back pockets. We don't talk about them, but they're the patients we never forget. I need you to know that it wasn't your fault, even though you blame yourself. Life does test us, and these experiences are amongst the most painful but also the most beautiful and rich that medicine can offer us as we understand our humanity and frailty. We stare into the shadows, because when you look fully into those shadows, you are more human as a result. We can't stop death. Death is a part of life, and it's humbling for us to know that and remember that at times. And so we move on to humility. Life and medicine are a long lesson in humility. Despite all our skills and knowledge, we're often still very powerless in what we do, and we have to come to terms with the limits of our own knowledge and the limits of our own importance. But for me, humility has always been tied up with the wonder as well of what our bodies are able to do, the strangeness of our bodies, the way they work well, the way they work badly, This was really brought home recently when I was involved with a little boy, and I promise it is a happy story, who'd suffered a brief cardiac arrest in my department but survived, and he had malignant hypertension. We were seeing him every week as a complication of his disease, which was very mysterious but thought to be a form of arteritis that was slowly dissolving his aorta from distal to proximal at a rate of knots. He had collateral circulation all over his body. He was swollen up like a balloon with the $100,000 of immunosuppression he was on a month, but nothing was working. He'd stopped growing, he'd stopped walking, he'd stopped playing. And at this point, a vascular surgeon offered the family an aortic graft. Nobody knew whether it would work or not. And then, in the way of things, because I work in a big, busy hospital, I didn't hear what happened. And that was 7 months ago. And then last week, his case came up at our M&M meeting in the hospital, and I thought, well, I know which of the M's he's going to be. But to my absolute surprise, the reason I hadn't seen him for 7 months was because he was so well. In fact, he'd been able to come off all of his immunosuppression. His antihypertensives were being weaned. He'd started growing again, and more importantly, he'd started playing again. And his recovery was really nothing short of miraculous, because nothing would have predicted really that that operation should have worked for this process, but it did. And so I'd just like us to think for a moment of all of those patients, all of those cases where we were in awe or wonder at the apparent miracle that had occurred, probably in spite of us, and completely because of what was happening in his own body. But that is the beauty and wonder of the work that we do. Lastly, I'd like to pull out of my suitcase love, because love underpins everything that we do. It's absolutely fundamental to our work as carers. Love is important for humility. Love helps to give us solace when we suffer heartbreak. Love helps us get through the hard work, and love makes us patient with our patients. I'd like to introduce you to Eva, who's my niece. She's 12 years old. She's obsessively interested in the teachings of the Dalai Lama in the same way other 12-year-olds are obsessed with Harry Potter or the pyramids. She also has Rett syndrome, and I know that most of you will understand what that means. She can't talk. She doesn't walk, she's in a wheelchair, she has seizures, and yes, she will probably die sooner than she should. But I've learnt so much from Eva. Because of the limitations of her physical body, the way she communicates is through eye gaze. But you need to be very patient. It takes her about 30 seconds to respond to any question. Most people lose patience before then and give up and wonder why Eva won't communicate with them. But in a recent study looking at 700 patient encounters with 300 different clinicians, the average time it took for a doctor to interrupt their patient or their family for the first time was only 11 seconds. I just want you to think about that for a moment. Because what Eva's taught me is that if you wait for longer than 11 seconds, you might discover what the patient really wanted to tell you, what they really needed to say. And before you think, well, that could take 4 years. The average time that it took for patients and their families to convey what it was that they wanted to tell their clinicians was only 92 seconds. So I offer you a challenge. The next time you see a patient, I want you to not interrupt them for 2 minutes. And you might be utterly surprised at what you learn, but you might also be utterly surprised by how well the rest of that interaction goes with them, because you've shown them love and respect by listening well for 2 minutes. The other thing that Eva has taught me is to not make any assumptions based on the child I see before me in the bed in the emergency department. Eva, in fact, has normal intelligence. She goes to primary school. She's in grade 6, and she'll start high school next year at a mainstream school. She's just travelled around Australia with her parents in a camper trailer. And because I love her, I was so worried about all the things that might happen to her, you know, pneumonia, seizures, anaphylaxis. In fact, the worst thing that happened was that she got an infected mosquito bite, and sometimes the driving was very boring. And if you ask her and wait for a response, she'll tell you that the journey was amazing. And at almost 12, she knows way more about my own sunburnt country than I ever will. And so I leave you with this. I would ask you to approach both your work and your life with love, with humility, with humour, and with the fruits of your hard work. Hold that heartache in your back pocket, but take it out from time to time and maybe talk to somebody else about it who understands. It is precious and difficult work, the work you all do, and I want to thank you for bringing your whole selves to it. Thank you.
Powerful indeed. Thank you for listening. Thank you, Fiona.